Let me say, I hope this panel is indeed a safe space away from vigilante McCarthyism. That was a terrific comment there by Professor Huang. Before I introduce our wonderful panel here, let me just make a few remarks about the topic today, which is China's emergence as a tech superpower. And before I do that, let me also say kudos to the Asia Society. What a terrific gathering. What a wonderful group of people in this room. I honestly can't remember more heavy hitter China analysis and analysts at a single gathering in Europe. Well done. I'd like to introduce our panelists in just a minute, but I want to frame the topic a little bit, if that's okay. Everybody is now familiar with DeepSeek. Everybody knows that the emergence of DeepSeek, apparently out of a clear blue sky, wiped more than $500 billion off the share price of NVIDIA in a single day. I think people also know of BYD. You may know that BYD outsold Tesla in Europe in the month of April. So the China tech disruption story is now a fairly well-established theme. But I wonder if we should start by thinking a little bit about what might be next. Which big name US, European companies might be disrupted by another extraordinary tech event coming out of China. I noticed that Alibaba and its Q1 AI large language models are dominating the rankings of impressive LLMs these days. And I notice also that Alibaba Cloud is outpacing both Google and Amazon Web Services in Asia. In renewable energy, we've seen the extraordinary news that over the last year, China's carbon emissions actually fell for the first time on record. And if we look at areas such as wind turbines, we can see that some extraordinary new technology is coming out of China. And these turbines are costing about 30 to 40% less than the cheapest alternatives available in Europe. If I was in Oslo the other day, I spoke to the head of a big shipping company there, and he told me that if you were to get a mid-sized cargo ship made in China, he had two that were currently being made, he said that would cost $50 million. If you were to get the same ship made in the US, it would cost $250 million. I'm sure you've all been looking at YouTube. I'm kind of glued these days to those videos of humanoid robots. And you know the one by Unitree, the one that can lie on the ground and then flip itself up in a single movement like that. I think it's called the G1. That costs $16,000 if you wanted to buy that. It's now moving into mass production. There's a very similar robot made by Boston Dynamics. It's called the Atlas. It can do similar things to the Unitree G1, but the Boston Dynamics robot costs, as far as I was able to find out online, about $140,000. So the Chinese robot is about 1/10 of the price. So all of these examples is really just to set up the discussion, which I think revolves around China's emergence as a tech power and what that means for the rest of us in the US, in Europe. Has China now actually overtaken the US as the world's leading tech power? There will be different opinions on that and different opinions on many of these topics. But let me introduce our truly fantastic panelists. I'd like to start with Dan Wang. Dan is a research fellow at the Hoover History Lab at Stanford University. We all know Dan well in the media. I think at the Financial Times he was by far the favorite tech analyst that we used to quote. Perhaps not featured as much on general topics as our Duncan Clark over here, but certainly when it came to tech, Dan was the guy. And Dan's got a new book coming out. His book is called Breakneck: China's Quest to Engineer the Future. I think it's coming out in a few weeks from now. I'm definitely putting my hand up for a review copy. Ruby Liu has flown over from Hong Kong. Thank you very much for that, Ruby. She's one of China's foremost VC investors, having founded Atypical Ventures, which is an early stage, effectively venture capital fund that's invested in 16 unicorns already and had 12 IPOs on NYSE, NASDAQ, and the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Perhaps the most notable deal was the one with Kuaishou, which is a short video platform that generated, I think, $14 billion return from a single deal. So, well done. Gary Rieschel is the founding managing partner of Qiming Venture Partners, which is one of the most famous VC firms operating in the China market. Literally, the roster of companies that Qiming has invested in is kind of like a who's who of the big successes in the China tech space. Some of the names you will all know: Xiaomi, Meituan, UbiTech, Bilibili, CanSino, Roborock, and many others. So it really is a huge pleasure to have this panel available to talk about these weighty issues. Gary, if I could stay with you to start with, please. Could you give a sense of what the ecosystem is like at the moment in China? Are we seeing a continuation of the emergence of lots of exciting young tech companies such as the ones you've invested in? Or are we, there's a lot of talk about China slowing down as an economy. Are we seeing this now move into a quieter phase?
Yes, I need this. Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much for Duncan and the team for inviting Yuka and I to be here today. So, is China slowing down? Parts of China. You see, again, when you look at China, you have to look at multiple tracks in the economy, as Professor Wang was mentioning earlier. The entrepreneurial track has slowed down, but it hasn't stopped. The entrepreneurs didn't die during COVID. And so what happened was the typical cycle in venture, which is things become too expensive, and then you have too much liquidity trapped in the companies, and then people start to hold back for the next cycle. And so the challenge in venture in China today is not geopolitics. The challenge is liquidity. So when you look at what has actually happened over the last 10 years, the amount of money that raced into the market was extraordinarily high. The Chinese capital markets have been a mess. We can talk about that all morning in terms of the trick that China pulled off, having an economy grow 2.5 times in 15 years and still have the world's lowest performing stock market. That is difficult to do. And so, but that's what the Chinese government managed to do by constantly interfering with the market dynamics, which we've used trust, et cetera. So we can talk a lot about that. But what happened in 2005 when we set up Qiming till today, during that 20-year period, in 2005 there was less than $1 billion available across all asset classes to invest in venture capital in China. Today, there's several billion, but in between, there's $1 trillion of venture capital that was deployed either by government funds or private funds that has been deployed against Chinese startups. The US is about $1.5 trillion. So what you have today is you have this massive ecosystem in China that is not going to go away. And in fact, I would argue that today, when you look at back at 2005, 2006, it was a great time. People say golden era for China venture capital. I actually think the return profiles for today's funds will be better than what they were then. Vastly improved ecosystem, vastly improved accounting infrastructure, vastly improved legal infrastructure. The capital markets are functioning better. They're still not where they need to be within the Chinese system. The Trump administration has yet to block Chinese companies from listing on the foreign exchanges in the US, which I think, hopefully they won't do that. And so you have this very, very rich ecosystem. So Qiming itself, we're the largest healthcare investor in China. So we have 250 companies we've invested in healthcare. We're also one of the 2 largest AI investors, advanced manufacturing investors, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a pretty interesting view of what's actually happening on the ground. And I would say the entrepreneurs are still enthusiastic, but they're having to solve tougher problems. So the wave from 2005 to 2016 was very much a consumer wave. You had all the social media, you had e-commerce, you had payments. Those were technology light deals. What you have now within the Qiming portfolio, we did 37 investments last year. It's not exactly slow. When you're doing nearly one investment a week, that's actually a quite healthy pace. There are a number of firms that are around that level, maybe slightly higher, slightly lower. So it's still quite healthy. But what you actually have now is you have people attacking advanced manufacturing. You're doing material science, you're doing semiconductors, you're doing the AI, you're doing the enterprise software. These are harder problems than putting up a website and taking payments or investing in e-commerce. So the transition has been from broad consumer-facing technology to very, very hard core tech that takes longer, requires more technical competence among the entrepreneurs, requires a better team. That's where we are today. That's what you're seeing in biotech. So it's gone from the basic rudimentary building blocks in China and healthcare back in 2005. They were spending 2% of GDP on healthcare. It couldn't go down. So when you look at what's happening today, it's 7.5%. And you have really, for the first time, you have truly innovative products in biotech being developed in China. So across a very broad range, the investment cycle, the investment ecosystem has become very mature. And China and the US are the only 2 countries in the world that have the entire venture capital life cycle within their borders. You can raise money, find entrepreneurs, invest, grow the companies, exit the companies, all within those borders. 80% of the venture capital in the world goes to those 2 countries. I'll stop there.
Wow, 80%. Ruby, from your perspective, how does it look? I mean, obviously there's a huge amount of opportunity in China, but is the competition really intense? I mean, is it hard to find good opportunities to invest in emerging tech companies, or are the valuations really out of whack, or how do you see the ecosystem?
So the ecosystem in China, like what Gary said, because of the liquidity constraint, and because of the sort of lack of exits, so that will cause venture investors like us who needs 15-year, usually 15-year run rate for a company to come to full maturity. Many of our funds are usually 10 plus, 2 or 3. So it allows the fund to have 15 years sort of timeline to develop, grow a company. And because of the lack of exit and the sort of the regulation climate, as a result of it, it makes the investors a little bit wary in terms of, okay, if I'm going to put money to bet with a company for the next 15 years and work with the founders, you really want the environment to be you can see there's a end of the rainbow, there's a pot of gold, and you also want to see that you have a stable climate where you can operate and grow your company. So to answer your question is, the environment is dampened, but on the other hand, it's not dry up, like what Gary just said. It's dampened but not dry up. But competition in China is less. I mean, I also spend a bit of time in the Bay Area, and I tell you, like, the whole world's capital is there chasing after very few good deals. So the Bay Area valuation, on the other hand, in my mind, is very unsustainable. Right? It better not have hiccups. And also I thought Gary's point about the technology, we go from internet age. I grew up as an internet investor, and I have to say, AI is so much harder to invest nowadays. And then the hardcore sciences that Gary is talking about, that I think one of the biggest trends that is how do you combine the hardware with the software and with the AI ability to serve increase human productivity, to serve humans, you talk about unitary. I imagine like when we get old, our generation will be served by robots. But the ultimate combination of this kind of cross science is so much harder, right? It requires much sort of deeper capital pockets. It requires a lot more cross-section engineers working together to get there. And it also sort of the engineering know-how in sort of production, that becomes also very important. So, it is a lot harder environment.
Yes, what you just said about humanoid robots reminds me of an interview I did in Shenzhen recently with the head of robotics at Hans Laser, which is a big robot company. And he told me that he said, I took care of my mother when she was old. My dream is that my daughter will not take care of me when I'm old because I want to be taken care of by a humanoid robot. And he said that by 2030, there will be 10 million humanoid robots taking care of elderly people in China. I don't know if that'll come true, but it's an extraordinary kind of vision that you get in China. Dan, just moving on to you, we heard some of this in Professor Huang's conversation just now, but there does seem to be a couple of competing narratives in China. One is this narrative of involution. In other words, extremely strong competition leading to very slim margins or even negative margins among tech companies. And the other is what I spent the preamble to this conversation talking about, which is China's rise as a tech power. You've been looking at this for a long time in China itself for a lot of that time. What do you see? How do you reconcile those narratives? Or maybe they're just not reconcilable.
Well, I was listening to Professor Huang throw a little bit of shade as a Beijing resident on Shanghai. Thinking back about, I was living in Shanghai during zero COVID, and we certainly didn't love Beijing back then either. So that was our perspective. I think thinking back about how my friends in Shanghai are still thinking about those days, I think speaks a little bit to this involution perspective. After the lockdowns in Shanghai in 2022, there's still quite a few folks who are pretty traumatized by that experience. None of them are wearing it on their sleeves, but get them over a few drinks or cocktails, perhaps cocktails around Urumqi Road, then they start reminiscing about that period quite a lot. Beijing is full of Marxists. I want to try to reason as a Marxist. How do Marxists really reason? Well, through this idea of the central contradiction. So what is the central contradiction today? Well, on the one hand, China's economy is slowing down, limb consumption, falling property prices, demographic transition. We can go on about all of these different ideas. On the other hand, take a look at these headlines and we have humanoid robots, we have BYD, we have DeepSeek, and we have all of the rest. And so how are we supposed to try to resolve this sort of central contradiction between the headlines of slowing growth on the one hand with remarkable technology achievements on the other? And the best way that I try to think about this is that I think about 50% of China's economy is pretty dysfunctional, and that 5% is going remarkably well. And it is that 5% that I think that many more of us should be thinking about. Now, if I were Gary and Ruby, I would be looking at even the 0.5% of China's most successful, and that is very impressive indeed. But if you take a look at some of the most successful parts of China's economy, they're doing better and better on electric vehicles as well as their batteries. They're doing better and better on all sorts of manufactured products. For a long while, we thought that maybe China wouldn't do very well on artificial intelligence because they are lacking chips, because of US technology controls, because of various data controls in China, because of censorship. Right now, it seems like they have come up with a reasoning model that is fairly competitive with Silicon Valley's. And so, again, I am thinking about the top 5% of China's economy, which is going extremely well, sometimes because of the state, sometimes in spite of the state. And this is the part that I'm thinking of as being at least somewhat threatening to some parts of American economic dominance as well as to European economic dominance. I keep wondering what will happen if all of the world's consumers buy Chinese electric vehicles. What does that do to the German car industry, to say nothing of the American car industry? I think a lot about the statistic that right now, on the track, the United Nations is projecting that China is on track to have about 45% of global industrial capacity by the year 2030. The United States, by that year, will have 11%. The United States plus every other rich country in the world, France, Germany, Japan, South Korea, is on track to have 39%. So 39% of industrial capacity for all rich countries relative to 45% in China. And this is where we have these enormous cost disparities that, James, you were talking about earlier, where the US today has about, China today has about 1,500 ships under construction. The United States has 5. And so, these are the sorts of disparities that really matter once you start to compete. The U.S. Navy used to have a saying that quantity is a quality all its own when it was far surpassing Japan in ship production during the war. Now I think it is China that is really surpassing the United States in all sorts of industrial components. And so this is where we have to try to reconcile how much does this slowing economy, worse demographics, really defeat China's technology progress, which continues apace.
Gary, could you give us a bit more of a sense of how this looks on the ground? I mean, Dan's just been talking about, the ability of Chinese tech companies to produce extraordinary technology at very cheap prices. One of the companies you've invested in was Xiaomi. I just looked the other day. It's now, I think the market cap is about 200 billion these days. I might be a little bit off. But the most extraordinary thing I read about Xiaomi, and I'd love you to help us understand this, is it went from being a mobile phone company making Xiaomi mobile phones to a Chinese tech company making electric vehicles in 18 months. How is that possible? Can you explain how a company does that? I also noticed that Xiaomi sold 137,000 of these EVs in its first year of operation, which was more than either Ford or GM in the same year. And Ford and GM have been around for more than 100 years. How does a company go from being a mobile phone company to a car company in 18 months?
Yeah, I think the best quote about Xiaomi's cars is the Ford CEO saying it's the best car he's ever driven and he doesn't want to give it up because they smuggled one from China to Dearborn, Michigan, and the Ford CEO has been driving it the last year. So I think that's actually pretty cool. So it's a little bit of a mistake to say that Xiaomi went from cell phones to a car. Xiaomi, the year that it launched the phone, also had 56 hardware products under development. So vacuum cleaners, all sorts of other little products. You mentioned Roborock, you mentioned, they had headsets, they had a lot of hardware products. And as Ruby mentioned, hardware-software integration is not easy. We could have a long discussion on why internal combustion engines, none of us have ever bought an internal combustion engine car from China. Why do you buy an EV? It's a much, much simpler product. Why was it so hard for the avionics industry in China to take off? That hardware-software integration is tough. So what Xiaomi did very early was spread technology around a very broad supply chain and leverage that supply chain to create an ecosystem that was an analog and digital ecosystem. The reason that Apple spent a lot of money, a lot of time trying to build a car. Apple's a pure digital company. They have absolutely no experience building stuff that rolls around on the ground, has wheels, have movable parts that break. Apple just doesn't do that. Xiaomi did that, had that ability. So when Xiaomi went to its ecosystem partners and said, okay, we have this software, we're very, very good at the software, we iterate and update software very, very rapidly. That's really was the secret to the early launch of the Xiaomi phones. We're going to do this, we want to try to do the same thing with a car. They were able to do that at an extraordinary speed. You can argue, did they copy design, did they not copy design? At some point, a car has to look kind of like something else because a car is a car. So you do have to, they do start to look alike in the EV world, but they were extraordinarily successful in getting that launched. And I think that the other thing to think about with Xiaomi is, now they're going to go into some additional areas. And so anything that is a hardware product that requires updatable software, you should expect Xiaomi to try to have a major play. Their margins on their cars, they're still not making a lot of money on their cars, but the margins are actually better than most of the suppliers in China. Again, what they do is they go to their suppliers. In the early days of the phone, they did something very simple. They said, if you want to work with us, we want the price today as if we've shipped 1 million units. So their entire negotiating strategy that Lei Jun took on base was, okay, you assume today we've shipped 1 million phones. That's the price we want if you want to work with us. Phenomenally successful, because after a year, they had shipped 1 million phones. And so they immediately sucked that entire supply chain together. Just one other comment on supply chains and how difficult this is going to be for Europe and the US to deal with. I have an angel investment in a robotics company in Silicon Valley. And that company is not a humanoid robot, but it does a lot of very heavy industrial type of work. There are 38 major subcomponents, componentry in that robot that need to be sourced. 2 can be sourced in the US, 2 can be sourced from Germany, the other 34 can only be sourced from China. So when we start to think about what we're actually going to be able to do from an ecosystem perspective, that lift is very, very heavy.
That's a very profound insight. Ruby, could we switch a little bit to AI? You mentioned that it's difficult to get your head around some of the AI technologies out there. If it's difficult for you, I tell you it's pretty impossible for me. But what do you see happening? Do you think China's going to win in AI, if it's possible to use that terminology? Or what kind of advantages does China have? I suppose there's a huge number of consumers there, a huge number of people using AI, a lot of early adopters. How do you see that rivalry between China and the US playing out?
Well, personally, first of all, I want to talk about rivalry. It's actually fantastic because the US and China are competing so intensely. It makes both better in terms of technology, in terms of cutting edge thinking ahead of what we can do. And I actually think a bit of competition is healthy. Being a venture capitalist, we thrive on that. In terms of I mean, it's a very sort of probably a bit simplistic to think about who will win. But I mean, right now, because the game is not over yet, it's still going on. There's people going to charts to look at who's winning, who's losing, and in terms of what type of AI that people are working off. So AGI is the ultimate goal, of course, but US people, I would say, OpenAI, Anthropic probably is what people kind of where you build in terms of how we look at AI is what people are building their application on top of your AI. So the more you could become the foundational model that people pin into, meaning if you look at your phone, it's Android is the foundation, right? But in terms of today's AI, in the US, I would say OpenAI and Anthropic are where more and more people build onto it. In China, it would be DeepSeek and Qiming. Qiming is the Alibaba subsidiary, where I'm seeing more and more entrepreneurs are building their application on top of it. And then you may be, ultimately in the AI world, only experts will survive. Where, for example, vertical AI becomes where we are investing into, because the foundational model is probably set for now, unless there's sort of a new dramatic change. But where a lot of the vertical AI, where you will need to become a particular area's ultimate expert, is where it's commanding a lot of venture money. So to give an example, like in the US cursor, if you are a coder, the top coder, the top engineer, software engineer, they can code over 90, all they need to do is do 5 to 7% of work. The rest can be completed by cursor. So you don't need, as a result of it, you do not need like lots of entry-level engineers. So computer science degree, meaning was the best graduate, best subject to graduate from. This year, there's massive unemployment in the entry-level computer science graduates. So then, without the ability for young people to sort of enter into the field, to sort of grind through all those like codes, throughout the day for 14, 15 hours a day of coding experience for 10 years, how do you become an expert in it? But that's the world we are facing. So like each of the vertical AI is where like the power is beginning to concentrate on the top experts. And many of the rudimentary, basic are going to be done by AI, and the speed is picking up. So I think, it's a very interesting world we are entering into.
I read the other day that China has something like 44,000 STEM PhDs every year. Some of those guys will be in AI. Given that quite a few people are unemployed, is the cost of hiring a super smart AI engineer in China relative to the US, is it a lot less, or is that one of China's competitive advantages?
Being a VC for 20-some years, I actually think sort of cost is not cost is a competitive advantage, but not a sustainable competitive advantage. Like where I tell my Chinese entrepreneurs, in today's age, you just have to do everything, not only cheaper, but better, which is where with all. Every single EV car founders, many of them had the sort of life cycle of growth from software. Lei Jun, Gary would know very well. Xiaomi was not his first company, right? So, and with a lot of these EV guys, they started out, they were entrepreneurs. All 3 leading EV companies outside of BYD, they were entrepreneurs. They all had successful companies in software, in internet, before they moved into building their second or third company into EVs. And these people work 996, or actually 24/7. You can call them anytime. So, Professor Huang was talking about, sort of the macro China versus, why is it technology industry that you continue to produce such extraordinary outcome? Is because in tech, literally, I think there's a common understanding in value that 996 is what we accepted as our lifestyle. I mean, like as a VC, we do 996, right? This is abnormally for me rather than normal lifestyle. But so when you work like that, you have compounding effect of like once the timeline is long enough, you could accumulate know-how. So that's, I think it's the fundamental entrepreneurial spirit. Dan Wang say, despite the government or with the government support, I believe it's the fundamental drive.
Dan, just changing the subject a little bit, I'd like to talk a little bit about the effectiveness or otherwise of the US policies towards China to restrain China's rise as a tech power. I remember Ren Zhengfei, the CEO of Huawei, a few years ago did a lot of journalist interviews, and he would often tell the story in which he would show a photograph of a Soviet Union warplane in the Second World War that got shot up really badly over Germany, and it would have holes in its wings and holes in its fuselage, and it was flying back to Moscow. And he said, "This plane is Huawei. We don't know whether we will be able to reach Moscow and land safely, or whether we will become extinct. We're not sure whether we will survive this onslaught from the United States." What's your comment now, looking back from 2025, on this rivalry? How effective have the US sanctions been, and what about China's response to them?
I think that the United States sanctions on China with respect to technology controls have been very effective in spurring China's acceleration into becoming a much bigger technology-focused power. I've been studying some of these Huawei controls since the beginning, and before that, controls on ZTE and Fujian Qinghua. And one of the thoughts that I had most consistently was that a lot of these companies, leading companies in China, like Huawei, were very, very content to buy American technologies, chips from Qualcomm, equipment from Silicon Valley. But the US government left them no choice but to buy from domestic suppliers. That was something that Beijing had always wanted them to do, to purchase domestic. And Huawei had enough sense to refuse because the Chinese alternatives were always really bad. But now that the US government left them no choice, Huawei has been all sweetness and light in asking domestic suppliers to say, won't you please work with me, let's develop an alternative together, and let's work together to build the domestic ecosystem. And so when I took a look at Huawei's revenues just released a few months ago, its revenues have just about recovered to 2019 levels, which were the year of United States sanctions when it designated Huawei onto the entity list. And so Huawei has, you could say, more or less recovered to the state that it had been. Now, Huawei is not it's not the Huawei we knew and loved growing up. So this is a company that is still selling fewer mobile phones, but it is still recognizably the company that is selling leading 5G equipment. So I would say that the United States controls have been perhaps more effective in slowing China's rise in artificial intelligence. It is certainly the case that a lot of AI companies in China complain that they have very little ability to access chips. But I would say that at the same time, China has overcome so many of its technology difficulties. If I take a look at the landscape of China's tech progress today, right now we're in 2025. Earlier at the start of this year, I was speaking at Asia Society Northern California on their big 2025 program. And my assessment was that China had very broadly achieved most of its goals that it set out in 2015. If the planners in Beijing had realized where China would be in 2025, in spite of all of the controls that the United States has imposed on it, and all of these souring diplomatic relations that the plan had triggered, I would say that probably most of the planners in Beijing would be pretty happy that China now has a complete lock on clean technologies, that rare earth magnets have spurred the Trump to fold in this latest round of the trade war. That China is doing so well on electric vehicles that automotive has always eluded China up until the present day. There are still persistent weaknesses in semiconductors and aviation. China's plane is very heavily dependent on a American-French collaboration, and China is still very, very dependent on American semiconductor technologies, but it is going fairly well at present, and I say that, and I still see enough gas in the tank for China to continue increasing its technological momentum, again, in a way that I think is pretty threatening to America's industrial base, to some parts of the European industrial base as well, and that is something that we all have to grapple with.
Gary, could I ask you a similar question? I mean, you're based in the US now, having spent so long in China with so much experience of the Chinese tech scene. Who do you, just to put it simply, who do you think is winning, the US or China? Maybe you will resist that line of questioning, I'm not sure. But, and more generally, what should the US do? What should the West do? Is industrial policy an option? If you could talk a little bit about that, I'd be grateful.
Okay, so briefly, Jing Chen made a great comment this morning. You have to overcome suspicion. So if your approach to cooperating with someone is always going to be, they're going to take advantage of you, they're going to somehow put a camera inside a crane, inside a port to suck all the information about, I mean, it's like, seriously? If that's going to be your approach to life, you're going to be miserable going in the future. And so, the way that I think about US-China competition, if you tell me AI is a race, then what does it mean to win? No one can tell me what it means to win, because you're never going to end the game. And so the game is like a game of football, right? So I'll put it in European football terms. It's a very fluid situation. What's the one thing that you cannot do? Own goals. If you do own goals, you are guaranteed you are not going to win the match. And what's happening today is the U.S. is lining up to do free kicks in its own goal. And so it is embarrassing to look at the policy when you're trying to think long-term in terms of where this goes. It is not going to be effective. The other thing to think about in terms of AI in China, China has an advantage in that it really has ignored for the last 20 years enterprise software. There is no Chinese company in the top 50 most valuable enterprise software companies in the world. There's no Chinese pharmaceutical company. There's one in the top 30 or 40 in the world. So when you start to look at, will there be over time? Absolutely. So if you're looking at what you want to invest in, look at those gaps. That's a pretty simple algorithm to look at. So on enterprise software, SASIC, the state-owned enterprise asset, Professor Wang and I were talking about this last night. So it's not the most effective deployment of capital to put money in state-owned enterprises, but what it's going to do is create a massive enterprise software company base. So when people talk about central planning in China, I never think about China being centrally planned. I think about being centrally reactive. Once they see something that becomes important, they backfill and protect it in an extraordinary way. And so I think you're going to see that in AI and software. And I guess just one last quick comment. When people talk where China is today, who here has seen the movie Hidden Figures? If you haven't, watch the movie. It's about the 60s space race. And it's about, there's a woman, Catherine Goebbels and Al Harrison are the two principals. One's played by Kevin Costner and one's played by Martigi, and I'm going to forget her last name. And they're talking about Glenn in the first American into real space. And they say, okay, now we just need to figure out how to get to the moon. Catherine Goebbels says, in my mind, we're already there. When you want to see the future of what's happening with EV, what's happening with China eliminating these incredible insecurities that drive its behavior, you start to look at what they're doing on EV. It solves several different problems for them. Autonomous vehicles. They're now flying taxis around Guangzhou on test drives. The Western narrative is that we're still ahead. It doesn't matter, because the scale and the speed at which China can iterate is really the key. 34 nuclear power plants under construction. The Chinese grid system within 10 years, the US will be 10 to 15 years behind. And you actually never really catch up when you look at those kind of infrastructure projects. So lots of things to pick about China that I don't like. that I think they make terrible mistakes. The property market has clearly been a disaster. Lack of trust in capital markets has clearly been a disaster. But when you look at that 5% that we were referencing, or that 0.5%, that really is going to drive the narrative.
I would like to open this up to questions in a few minutes' time. Are there microphones that could rove around? Yep, we've got some over there. But before we do that, I'd like to get Dan's take on industrial policy in the US. You're at Stanford at the moment. What do you think can be done? And I don't know if you're comfortable talking about Europe, but I mean, my impression living in Europe now is that whatever the US is struggling with, Europe is struggling more.
I sign on to that, James. Gary talks about own goals from America, and I think that the only regions that might surpass own goals are Europe, and then best of all is China. Thinking about the extent of own goals that all the government, every government is creating on itself is enormous. Now, I've spent some time now thinking about American industrial policy. The Biden administration had a very big effort to localize semiconductor production in the United States. There was also an effort to create clean energy in America. And these efforts have been pretty tentative. The CHIPS effort allocated all of its money. There will be some close to leading edge fabs being built in Arizona and Texas, but the US has been far slower on trying to build up clean technology in a way that I think because the Democratic administration was not so focused on actually building all of these things. And one of the things that, even though the United States is going to build a little bit more infrastructure, one of the casualties of building far too slowly is that Donald Trump now has the opportunity to name so many more highways and bridges after himself now that all of these bridges are going to be built. And so, this is one of these issues where the United States moves really, really slowly, and it is trying to become a much more a bigger industrial competitor to China. But I do not see any of these efforts from the United States succeeding at the moment. There may be some benefit with deregulation from the Trump administration, but if you think about what are some of these drivers of technology competition, I don't really see that deporting a lot of workers to other countries is going to build an industrial workforce. I don't see that denying scientists to come to the United States and to try to weaken its universities and to reduce science funding to be at all of a benefit to the United States. And there is still much more of a focus in Trump's big bill to focus on coal rather than industries of the future like solar and wind. So, maybe a few positives. Gary talked about nuclear earlier, so the U.S. is building a few more nuclear facilities now, but for the most part, a lot of this is driven by Trump's own views of, coal being great. God's chosen fuel, I think, is one of the things he said, but not really thinking about what is going to be in the future. Now, I think what is really important is also that thinking about technology diffusion. I am in Silicon Valley, James, and one of the sayings that we have there is that technology travels at the speed of beer. Or if you're French, maybe technology travels at the speed of wine. But people will talk about all of these things. People move around different firms. Technology tends to diffuse. And right now, much of that diffusion is happening within China. I wonder if over the longer term, some parts of that will diffuse into the United States. It would help if the United States welcomed joint ventures and allowed Xiaomi cars to be driven by more than the Ford CEO. But right now, we're not in that scenario.
While people are thinking of their questions, Ruby, could I just come to you? Are you drinking much beer in Silicon Valley or wine in Europe? I mean, another way of putting this is there much money from the US and Europe going into Chinese startups these days? Is that still a channel that's quite vibrant, or is it really these days mostly Chinese money that's funding venture capital in China?
I mean, Gary and I, we take money from U.S. institutions traditionally, and then we deploy in China. Then the company will go public, on New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, or Hong Kong Stock Exchange. And that's how dollar-based investor exit their company. So there are still some, but a lot less US dollar-based capital into China. And the reason being all the, sort of rhetoric, as well as the fear, like pensions, for example. Pensions endowments are biggest venture capital sort of investors. And for them to be kind of weary of what could happen politically, it become a lot harder. So yes, dollar is on the decline, but RMB is on the rise. And like there are also family offices are definitely, like kind of China becomes a better diversification away from the from the US. So if if you think about like a sort of fortune allocation, people would, China is a market probably people don't want to miss out, just in case, like out of blue, the deep sea came. As a practitioner, I didn't even see deep sea coming from out of blue. And so as a result of it, you don't want to miss out. So people, I can see like a lot of capital that are long-term capital that are thoughtful about diversification or risk. They would have like 5 to 10% exposure still to China. As a result, there's still some dollar base.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? We've got a lot of questions. There's a gentleman in the back who already has the microphone.
Yeah, I already got the mic. Sorry, guys. I'll pass it on to you real quick. So my name is Peng Fei, trustee of Asia Society France as well. My question is regarding the opportunities for European tech. All last year I was listening to the US VCs talk about like the sheer scale of investment in AI, and I was wondering, I'm living in Amsterdam, I was wondering like how the heck can European industries ever catch up because of the sheer scale and the sheer amount of money that's required to invest in AI. And then DeepSeek came out, and I was like, okay, maybe that's an opportunity for Europe. And then the other thing is, relating to Ruby, what you were saying about vertical integration and vertical skill sets around AI. Europe has incredible amount of design-related thinking, incredible amount of creative engineers, great engineering talent. So I'm just wondering, for you guys, from your perspective, are there any great opportunities? What are the opportunities for European tech industries?
Ruby, opportunities for European tech. What do you think?
I think, first of all, start with the regulation. Yesterday I was going on and on about one click away. Like a click in internet, it's like a lifetime. So do you think about the collective social waste on consumer welfare? When you go into a website, you have to give consent. Well, if you are typing in, the URL, I assume you consented. So the fact that there's a social post that went viral among tech people was Europe leads in regulation, US leads in innovation, China leads in manufacturing. And so that was a post that last year that went viral. And so I thought one of the things that in terms of innovation, over-regulation is an enemy of great innovation. We suffer that in China as well. And second is, I actually think, I grew up in where I went from Silicon Valley to China, where at that time, when you started out in China, you kind of there's no Central Road up and down. There's the ecosystem, the life cycle of investing. But over time, it grew into it, right? So in Europe, I think there ought to be sort of, I think, a unison market, because Europe is a little bit too fragmented. A unison market is always great for tech, a sort of tech expansion.
Could we try and get two more questions in? There was a lady at the back who put her hand up straight away. And then after that, I think we probably have time for one more. And Alicia here.
Okay. I'm going to shift geography just a little here. Judith, I do sort of case study research and capital design at the intersection, looking at China, US, Africa. I'm shifting geography quickly. If China controls 70% of the world's cobalt supply to a country like DRC and dominate processing of other critical minerals, can any country truly be tech superpower without first resource superpower?
Dan, that's very similar to what you were talking about earlier. Would you take that one?
I think the resources can be critically important for a lot of semiconductors as well as EVs. Congo has about 70% of cobalt. China processes about 90% of all rare earth minerals. The United States used to have a footing in this, and I'm thinking about when you take a look at the environmental costs of rare earth processing, the cancer rates in northern China where they do process these things are off the charts. The smoke is completely orange. They burn so much energy to process these things. As part-time resident of California, can I imagine that any California resident would put up their hand to say, yes, we need a rare earth refinery in our backyard? No, absolutely not. And so this is one of these things where I think the West is going to be in a hard place to be able to have these rare earth processing is so environmentally intensive and polluting that only the Chinese have the stomach for this. And I don't imagine that the US is going to be able to do this very well. And I don't imagine that the French people are really inclined to breathe these things either. And so that is definitely a challenge to try to overcome.
I think it's important that the countries that have these resources, they insist on processing within their borders, because that's where the value chain starts to happen, and that globally people agree on a set of standards in terms of the environment, in terms of how it has to happen. Otherwise, you'll have countries arbitrating cost structures, and basically you have to decide, is a human life a human life? And so given the scale of this and the longevity of it, this is actually something that the UN or different organizations on a global basis could lean into. Because if you strip away the cost advantage of killing people in order for processing, then you can actually have an intelligent economic discussion around where this processing should occur. But the countries that are simply doing the mining, I mean, basically you're selling your future for 10 cents on the dollar.
Alicia, and then that probably will be our last question.
Thank you. So, I guess the picture I think the three of you you have shown a picture of China dominating. I would basically summarize it that way. Dominating technology, dominating critical raw materials, dominating industrial production. Let me focus on that last one. And I think the three are related because, as you said, if you miss one, you can't do the rest, yeah? You can be very good at basic science, I think actually Europe is, but you can't scale because we're fragmented. I quite agree with that. So now the question is, if all of this is the case, what you just said, that China will get to 45% of industrial production in the world, I have two questions for you. How are you going to finance this? I know you have excess savings, but I also know that your corporates today are reducing capex even in the most innovation-intensive sectors. They're not making much money. You are scaling, but your profit margin is going down as a rock. So who is going to pay for this? Second question, who is going to consume it? Because I can't believe, I really can't, that you can escape conflict, military conflict, with that scenario. A country that produces 45% of everything the world needs, if not more, and in subsectors, probably 100%, because we're very close to that already. So how do you do this?
Who would like to take that? I mean, I guess the first one is,
I'll do a quick one, which is, I'm not sure which corporations you're talking about profits declining.
10,000 listed companies in China.
Well, I'm not talking about China. So, but who's profiting right now? I mean, right now there are 3 U.S. companies whose market cap exceeds the market cap of the entire European bourse system. You should really think about what that means. So that concentration of wealth, Microsoft is not reducing CapEx. The European companies might be, and Chinese companies, Xiaomi's not reducing CapEx. So again, you have to take that strip of companies in China, which are really driving the future. That group of companies is not reducing CapEx. The biotech companies in China are not reducing CapEx. So if you're looking ahead 10 years, there's a huge number of companies that are increasing CapEx and R&D spending in China. And so I think it's really a question of how much can that drive the entire economy in China. It's an experiment. That's what they're trying to do. We'll have to see.
I think we got 60 seconds.
The solar industry in China has been a huge money loser for a lot of investors. The margins for many years have been negative. It is joyless, miserable competition to produce the world's best solar panels, which the Chinese have been doing. Their products keep getting better. There's basically very little product differentiation between them, yet they make quite a lot of these things. And so, I think, when I think about the solar industry, this is a huge boon for consumers. This is a national strategic advantage, but it is miserable for investors. I wonder, maybe this is what socialism with Chinese characteristics really means in that sort of competition. And then when it comes to 10 seconds, who will consume all of these things? Well, if the US and Europe want to raise tariffs on solar, that is its choice. And I think that Beijing is going to say, we dare you to do this, and see whether they actually do this. Now, the United States actually has banned a lot of solar. I wonder if Europe will also ban a lot of Chinese solar as well.
Thank you so much, Ruby, Dan, Gary, for so many fascinating points.